Welcome to The Hash, everyone. We are set up for another week of bringing you all of the latest and greatest in crypto and culture. My name is Naomi Brockwell, and on the show today, we've got a little bit of a mix-up of roles. We have Ben Powers, we have Adam Levine, David Morris, Nate DiCamillo. Welcome to the show, guys. And let's dive straight into it. Some huge news. So what have we got there, Adam?
Yeah, so the president of El Salvador said at a Bitcoin conference over the weekend that supposedly was pretty good, that they're moving to make Bitcoin legal tender and include it in, frankly, a bunch of different ways in the country. We don't have all the details on this yet, but we do have a little bit of video from the announcement. If we can go to that now.
In El Salvador, we are trying to rescue this idea and start the design of a country for the future, using the best ingredients that makes us who we are, while using sensibility to find the best examples of ideas from history and around the world. I believe Bitcoin could be one of these ideas. That is why next week, I will send to Congress a bill that will make Bitcoin a legal tender in El Salvador. In the short term, this will generate jobs and help provide financial inclusion to thousands outside the formal economy. And in the medium and long term, we hope that this small decision can help us push humanity at least a tiny bit into the right direction. I entered politics to leave a legacy for my country, but while doing it and by working with like-minded people, maybe we can help create a legacy for the world.
So now, El Salvador, not a big country, but this is actually a pretty big announcement. David, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the most important context here is that El Salvador already uses the dollar as its primary currency. So they're already kind of subject to external monetary influence. And I think this is a really good example of maybe they'd rather be subject to the outside influence of a neutral system like Bitcoin rather than a currency that's actually controlled by a separate government. One other piece of context here that is important and we will expand on, but this announcement came almost simultaneously with the announcement that the president of El Salvador's government was going to be withdrawing from an anti-corruption investigation, and that has kind of upset and worried people in the U.S., which has sort of had some concerns about his authoritarianism. But, you know, we can get deeper into that.
Yeah, I'll jump
Naomi?
in here because David, what you said is absolutely correct. They've been using the US dollar as their denomination, right? And it's important to see, like, what happens when there's a separation of money and state? What kind of money do the people choose? And they're going with Bitcoin because, you know, in the US, there's so many incentives to print money and it ends up hurting a lot of people. And then in El Salvador, they're like, hey, we don't want to be hurt by the US's money printing. It's not helping us for them to print money. It's only hurting us. So they're seeing firsthand the effects of this money printing. And it's like, it's such a powerful statement for them to call out the central banks to say, we are tired of the debasement of the money supply. And so we're going for something that is determined by code that has a limited supply. We're going with Bitcoin. It was so powerful. I was at the presentation where they announced this, and oh my God, I have never seen such an uproar from the crowd. Everyone just like on their feet, just shouting. It was so loud because people understood what this meant. This is like the first step in what could be a flurry of maybe other countries following suit if they're in a similar position to El Salvador. But Nate, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I think that also it's kind of interesting that after this, the president also tweeted that any crypto traders that wanted to come to El Salvador could be instantly granted citizenship. So kind of another play for him to increase the GDP of his country by getting a bunch of rich people to move there.
So now one thing that kind of didn't move around this. Sorry, go ahead, David.
I think he said residency, not citizenship, but that's a nuance. So
thanks for that clarification. Yeah. So structurally, this is significant. I want to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Ben, we were watching market reaction around this, and it didn't really seem like this moved the needle. What's kind of thought there? I was
going to say that the lack of market reaction maybe is more to the point in that sense. There just wasn't a lot of movement on the price point with this announcement. I thought that was, an interesting contrast. Naomi, you mentioned like the crowd that was viewing this was kind of, raucous and really enthusiastic about it. But yet, like, we're not seeing the price trade up or trade down. And I think that's particularly maybe interesting on the one hand. I would maybe say frustrating on the other, because I think when we see like Elon Musk move markets with a tweet, the lack of like a country potentially adopting this as like legal tender, not moving it, just shows sort of the chaotic nature of how these things move. So that's my personal frustration in this regard. But I do think it's really interesting, and I do think it continues this experiment that we've been seeing of, you know, centralized actors, aka states, really getting involved in Bitcoin heavily, whether we've been talking about that in relation to Iran or whether we've been talking about that in relation to, you know, now El Salvador like adopting this. I think it's just really fascinating to see how a centralized entity is acting or going to be interacting with something as decentralized as crypto, and then what inevitable conflicts are going to come out of that.
So now, one thing that's been really interesting to me, and frankly, I really want to echo everything that Naomi said earlier in this segment. I think that this is significant from a variety of reasons, but I think we can draw back and look at what Venezuela did with the cryptocurrency some years back, and we can draw some kind of interesting comparisons between those. So now, both of these nominally are supposed to help with remittances, make things less expensive. They, again, in the case of Venezuela, ameliorate sort of the effects of sanctions that prevent them from using the traditional financial system. But Venezuela created their own cryptocurrency that their government has the power to issue, backed by their own assets, which means that you have to trust the government. And I think that that's kind of the key difference that we're really seeing here with this one, and why it's so important is that effectively much of the world has outsourced its monetary policy to the United States via the dollar. And that's because the United States, in comparison to a small South American nation, often is seen as a better managed currency. But that's kind of the least dirty shirt. Right, and that's kind of one of those arguments, right? It still is has these problems. It just has them in ways that are better than the local alternative. Bitcoin is in contrast to that. Bitcoin has fixed monetary policy that isn't being conducted for the benefit of any government, and which has a very long-term sort of predictable rollout. And that's kind of why this is such a significant thing from my eyes. David, I saw your hand go up. Where are you?
Yeah, so we need to close out this story, but I just wanted to make sure to drive home the questions about corruption, because there have been coverage that's sort of, frankly, rather vague. The new president has done some stuff to restrain the power of the judiciary, but that comes on the heels of 30 years of corrupt rule by other parties. And I think that the Bitcoin in Iran parallel is also important because, frankly, the US CIA overthrows governments in South America for sport on a regular basis. And if I were a leader of a country like El Salvador, I would be looking not just for monetarily, but politically a way to reduce the power of the US over my domestic economy. And right now, a lot of El Salvador's economy relies not just on remittances from the US, but also aid from the US. So if you can decouple either or both of those a little bit from American political power, that's good for them locally. And to also put that in context, the sort of negative stuff about this president has to be read in that context of, these overthrows are often sort of previewed by negative press coverage in the US.
Right. So let's actually change track here. I want to move to talk a little bit about what JP Morgan is doing at the moment. So we all remember JPM Coin and everything going on with that. Well, the executive of JP Morgan said that the next step is programmable money. Now, what does that mean? So he said in a recent interview, actually, programmable money is what it can do to you, whether it's conditional payments, whether it's things like tax assessments. These are very rules-based, and in the past, you'd have to send specific instructions to a bank like JP Morgan. We increasingly want you to be able to program these things and actually tell the money what to do. So I definitely have some thoughts on this, but Ben, I'm going to throw this to you to start off with. What are your thoughts on this programmable money direction that JPM is going in?
And I'm going to give it right back to you to get those thoughts, Naomi, so hit me with them.
Well, I mean, as soon as I hear programmable money, you have JPM saying these kind of innocuous things. Oh, well, just like conditional payments, all of this. If we look at what China was saying when they were like programmable money, they were saying, well, we'll be able to easily freeze accounts and seize assets. We'll be able to program into the money that if you don't touch it in your bank account, if you decide to just, want savings, then we can immediately make that money or like burn it or make it worthless. So programmable money is kind of a double-edged sword. And I'm only interested in it from the side of the free market, not when you have like a corporation or a government in control.
Are you telling me that it is just a tool that can be used by anybody for whatever they want? Is that what I'm hearing? Because I think that gets at kind of a lot of the underlying things here. And I think you're spot on that it is a double-edged sword. And we talk about programmable money. That's not a panacea for anything. That just means it can be programmed to do what you want. But Adam, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so this one is, again, another one of those classic, oh, hey, look at that. A bank thought of something we've been focused on for the last 6 or 7 years thing, right? Like, oh my God, what an amazing idea you've had. Yeah, I mean, it's to the last story. I just have to continue to go back to that because it's so relevant. The idea isn't that you can control something. The question is, who can control something, who makes the rules, and who enforces the rules, and who do those rules apply to, and when will they change? These are all really, really, really important questions that doesn't really matter if you're looking at like a cryptocurrency project or if you're looking at, like a physical, money system issued by governments or something that a bank is doing. What matters is that these structures, if they're not neutral, if they're not actually just based on following the rules and don't have this kind of arbitrary, well, we're going to decide this or that kind of element to them, they're not different than our current system. They're slight improvements in some ways. And frankly, in other ways, they can be much more expensive. They can be they can be worse in other ways too. So you really kind of have to pick and choose the elements of the technology that have that kind of innovative world-changing element to them. And the rest of the stuff is just kind of like a follow-on. So this is, again, classic JP Morgan, classic big bank behavior. They saw the headline, they got excited about it, they did the dumb thing, and now we're talking about it.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there, Adam, because the need for big banks to work closely with governments and to comply with sanctions is one of their biggest expenses. And so one of the uses for Link that they're doing now, or that JP Morgan is doing now, is this service called Confirm, where they can better identify who the payee is before they settle a transaction, who's making the payment, and it's to be able to follow sanctions more easily, to have less false positives and that sort of thing. So this is definitely the novelty of being able to program money is something that this big bank can use to be able to survey, their transactions more easily at less cost to them.
Yeah, nothing can ever go wrong here, right? Obviously, if you're programming money to behave in a certain way. I'm just thinking of predictive policing algorithms and all the other things where it's oh, tech is going to solve this. And I think this is definitely an instance where blockchain doesn't fix this in a lot of ways, even though, we're not necessarily talking about that. But writ large, if you're trying to bring tech into kind of conversation with people's behavior and laws, that gets really, really messy really, really quickly, and can have a lot of cascading negative effects that we don't often think about, and particularly I think developers don't often think about until way after the fact when they're impacting people's lives. So I'm going to be watching this with interest, with a bit of skepticism for sure, but I think there's a lot of other context that we need to think about when JP Morgan's entering into code-based rules and laws. That gets hard.
For sure. Well, let's wrap it up there and take a quick break. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking about Donald Trump calling Bitcoin a scam. That's a name that hasn't been in the media much recently, but we'll dive into that after the break.
Next one to no one. And welcome back. You're watching The Hash, where we discuss the latest and greatest in crypto news and culture. So, coming to the table today, I got a story that I published on Friday, which is about BlockFi, the crypto lender, sort of continued fallout from a variety of botched promotions, giveaways, and essentially just handing BTC over to users. So, on May 14th, BlockFi tweeted that they were having issues, and some users might see, false balances in their accounts, and CoinDesk covered that on May 18th, I believe. And at first, BlockFi was saying this is just in relation to March promotional issues, in which users were rewarded and were supposed to be rewarded in GUSD, which is a stable coin, but instead were rewarded in BTC to the tune of, I talked to one user who got 329 Bitcoin incorrectly deposited to his account, which at the time was about $16 million. And since that reporting on the 18th, it's expanded, and BlockFi has now said, you know what? It's not just in relation to that promotion. It's in relation to just some transactions. And while Zack, the CEO, has downplayed it at Consensus even last week, saying that, look, this affected sub 100 users and less than $10 million worth of things, and everything's funds are fine. I talked to multiple users who were able to move some of that Bitcoin off of platform, meaning beyond BlockFi's control. And BlockFi has since gone and done threatening legal notices. They've made phone calls to some users saying, give us back this money. And this is just a real mess at this point. And I think shows some of, again, we were just talking about the issues of when you bring tech and people together. This is maybe one of them. But I want to wrap that intro there. And Adam, give me your initial reactions to this kind of ongoing saga that we're seeing in regards to BlockFi.
What a mess. I mean, that's the primary thing. Talk about an error to make is conflating dollars with Bitcoin, right? Someone who was supposed to get $300 worth of reward got 300 Bitcoin worth of reward. That is, I don't even have any intelligent commentary around this. That is just such a huge mistake that that frankly is disqualifying for me around really anything around this company. How do you make a mistake like that and then continue it on into the next month? It's bad. It's real bad.
It's incredibly bad. I'll jump in there and just say, when you have an error like this, let's say it was a human error and someone made a mistake. If you have such a system collapse from a human error, then your system is bad. It's not the person who made the mistake. It's the way that they've set this up that they were able to make such a crazy mistake. But Nate, I'll throw this to you.
Yeah, what this reminds me of, and this isn't to say that BlockFi has this issue. I don't know. I don't know how BlockFi does its accounting, but it does remind me of the recent
this story, so we can speculate at that point.
Right. So it does remind me of the bankruptcy of crypto lender Cred, and part of that bankruptcy was due to the fact that they commingled customers' assets with the businesses' assets, which made it so that the company really couldn't figure out, what belonged to who, kind of thing. And that it's something where, especially as these crypto lenders become more important for OTCs, desks, or for hedge funds or whatnot, those firms be transparent about how they do their accounting, how they know where funds are and who they're sending it to.
Yeah, and I think I should point out at this point that when, Zack was at Consensus, he did say that there was a bug that seemingly allowed for these sort of incorrect deposits. And then a derivative of that bug allowed people to move the money off platform. And I talked to, one of BlockFi's competitors kind of in the space to get an idea of, how this might have played out at another company or what might be the reasons this could happen. And I think that, they said it's definitely the second part of that bug where you can move the money off platform even after, and I talked to some customers who had done so, input a withdrawal cancellation request that was then confirmed by BlockFi, and yet the money was still moved out to a cold storage wallet. So that sort of tech issue is the real concern here. Obviously BlockFi was able to reverse a lot of these transactions. It showed, according to one Reddit post, 700 Bitcoin, and then that got reversed within a couple hours. But in other instances with people I talked to, one person didn't hear from BlockFi for days. The account or the transaction was not reversed for days. They entered into a business contract based on the belief that they had this money in good faith from BlockFi, and they multiple times checked the proposal or the deposit, which said this is an April promotion, and now they're on the hook
there's some,
for violation of contract.
Context
so,
here.
So they say.
There's an important parallel here. So late last year, Citibank accidentally sent an extra $500 million to a loan client, and they ultimately were legally not able to get that money back. It's a different situation because it was ultimately actually what somebody was owed. But it is interesting because there are instances where mistaken sends can be legally enforceable. So these people that they're trying to claw back from, don't send it. Fight it, frankly, because you might get lucky.
Which is what one is considering doing. They're looking at legal options, saying like, "This, I made decisions based on your good faith, allegedly." And now they're trying to figure out what the next steps are, because it puts some people really between a rock and a hard place. And I think it illustrates like the issues that happen from these like bugs or mistakes. Like they have human costs. But Naomi, what do you got?
I just wanted to add to that when you have users using this isn't just company errors that happen. It's really difficult to use crypto. We're not at a point yet where we've taken out the friction. I've had many examples of paying for things in a store, and instead of putting in $5, they put in 5 Bitcoin Cash. And it's like, oh, that's a very expensive coffee. So just be really careful when you're doing your own transactions as well. If you're just getting into the space, make sure you check. Did you put it in the right fee section? Did you put the right, in crypto amount? Did you put the right amount in US dollars? And double and triple and quadruple check those. It's super important because companies like BlockFi can make the mistake. You absolutely can. But let's change track. Go to something kind of interesting. David, what have we got?
So we had Donald Trump, I think on Sunday, making some interesting comments about Bitcoin, calling it a scam, but calling it a scam in a very interesting way. And I believe we have the tape.
My opinion is that with the currency of this world should be the dollar. And I don't think we should have all of the Bitcoins of the world out there. I think they should regulate them very, very high. But the currency should be the dollar. And when you have things like that out there, Seward, what happens is you really lose something. It takes the edge off of the dollar and the importance of the dollar. Bitcoin, it just seems like a scam. I don't like it because it's another currency competing against the dollar. Essentially, it's a currency competing against the dollar.
Now, what's interesting about this is we've heard Bitcoin called a scam a million times, right? But here, Trump is not really using the word scam in the way that we think of it. He's saying it's bad because it competes with the dollar. And that's actually kind of an endorsement, right? This is what Bitcoiners want people to think. There are a couple of reads on Trump that are relevant here. One is that he's very susceptible to influence. So he's heard this. He's heard from somewhere that Bitcoin is a competitor to the dollar, and he's repeating it. And that gets that narrative out there in a way that, frankly, even though he's saying it as a negative, I would say good for Bitcoin. And the other point that somebody made was that, he's very prone to saying the quiet part loud, right? That's a read on Trump that goes for a lot of different things. And here, a lot of the criticism about Bitcoin, I think we can actually say has been, inaccurate. Like it's not the real problem. He's identifying the real problem that people find, which is that it's a competitor to the dollar. Adam, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so this is an element that I really love about Trump, which is that quiet part loud thing, right? Like when you look at Janet Yellen's comments, right, and you look at other officials' comments, they talk about things that aren't real problems, right? If you're concerned about terrorist financing, it's very easy to say, oh, well, that's why we need to do something about Bitcoin. But the reality is, even by the Fed's own statistics, most terrorist financing happens in US dollars, and there's no real conversation about getting rid of that. Really,
JPM
this currency competition angle, this currency competition angle really is the thing that members of the US government and frankly, governments around the world don't like, because Bitcoin presents an alternative that can't be stopped through conventional sanctions. It basically kind of takes the control out of their hands. Now, if you're responsible for the continuity of the US government and the kind of way that things work right now, as empowered by the US dollar as a global reserve currency, that's pretty scary. And the more real Bitcoin gets, kind of the more of a threat it becomes. So that's kind of the way that I read these comments. So Ben, what about you?
I mean, two sides of the same coin maybe, but I'm holding Musk and I'm holding Trump up here at like side by side in terms of the deep and nuanced understanding around Bitcoin. I think particularly I kind of chuckled at Trump saying, all those Bitcoins out there in the world, we gotta take them down.
Bitcoins
It's
in
like,
the world.
exactly. And just shows kind of a fundamental lack of understanding in this issue. David, I think your kind of read on the framing of this is maybe the interesting thing in regards to, it being a competitor to the dollar and that being the point of consternation now, not just like, this thing is a scam or this thing is, totally useless or something like that. Like that could be where a lot of that frustration comes from. That being said, on the flip side of this, we talked about the market not moving in regards to El Salvador. I'm very happy it did not move based on these comments because, it's definitely not something that should be pushing the price one way or the other. But Naomi, what you got?
Yeah, just to add on to David's point about saying the quiet part loud, the first time we saw that was 2019 when Brad Sherman said in Congress, and everyone in the Bitcoin community was like, did he just say that out loud? Like, does he know that he said that out loud? He says, if Bitcoin does achieve its objectives and perhaps displaces the US dollar or interferes with the US money being virtually the sole currency in the world, then, that's a problem. And the fact that he was like actually saying it, like the issue, is it will succeed and the result of that will be it will displace the US dollar. And that's our major concern. It was such an enlightening moment because everyone in crypto knew that. Everyone in Bitcoin knew that. But the politicians were beating around the bush, as both you and Ben mentioned, David. And so it's interesting now that Trump is coming out and saying the same thing. I wonder whether we're going to, just see an increase in politicians feeling okay with like maybe jumping on the bandwagon saying, well, no, this is the reason why we need the US dollar as the world reserve currency and all of this, or whether, they will kind of sweep that narrative under the rug and keep doing the environmental things, the drug dealer things, the, OFAC sanction list, all of that stuff. But Nate, what are your thoughts?
I have to say that it's a little laughable that Donald Trump says that he cares about the strength of the U.S. dollar in terms of just a little laughable in terms of like last year I was speaking to Lebanese economists about how the Lebanese pound was being devalued, and part of it was because of the politicization of the central bank and it had no independence, and Donald Trump was notorious for threatening the independence of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So it seems very unbelievable to me that Donald Trump actually cares about the strength of the dollar.
He was also a big fan of regulation, right, Nate?
Go ahead.
I just want to quickly correct, those comments were made today. So they actually do seem to maybe have been in response to what happened in El Salvador. But I saw Adam's hand.
So, I mean, the whole thing here is this competition element, right? It's that if you like, there's a Streisand effect here that happens too. If the conversation becomes around the idea that Bitcoin something should happen to it as a result of it competing with and potentially eventually displacing the US dollar, then that requires a conversation around why the US dollar has this role in the first place, should it have it? And that's not a conversation that anybody on that side of the table actually wants to have. So to the degree that becomes the conversation, that becomes a problematic conversation for these governments to pursue.
In which fundamentally it's about power, right? That's what all of these conversations are about. Politics, all of this. That's the reason like Trump is weighing in on this, is because it's about fundamental power dynamics, and that's why people care. So like at the root of all of this is power and control, and lots of interesting dynamics that are going to continue to be on the table.
Well, talking about dollar debasement, Nate, what have we got in terms of the inflation narrative right now?
Right. So it's shaken up a little bit in that the Biden administration seems to have made its first kind of inflation prediction at a G7 meeting of finance ministers in London. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that we could see higher inflation rates through the rest of 2021, as high as 3%. She later clarified that she expects this higher inflation to be transitory, settle back down to the Fed's 2% target. So you got to remember the Federal Reserve is looking for 2% inflation on average on an annual basis. That's their like sweet spot. So this meeting was also where Yellen encouraged a more dovish spending practice to the other G7 finance ministers. So with interest rates, likely remaining kind of low for the rest of the year, investors could probably turn to Bitcoin instead of bonds to be rewarded for losing money on that inflation, which inflation generally hurts lenders, hurts those investors. So I wanted to kick it to Adam. Actually, I was curious to know, in terms of this prediction, how much will this add to inflation concerns globally, especially with Yellen asking other countries to continue spending? And are there other indicators of inflation at play here on a global stage?
Well, the short answer is yes, there are lots of other indicators of inflation. My favorite indicators of inflation are how the US government used to calculate inflation in the 1990s and the 1980s. If you go and you actually look at those, which you can see on a site called shadowstats.com, basically the methodology changes, right? They change how they calculated, but you can go back and you can look at those past calculations. And by the 1990 standard, we're looking at currently about 8% inflation. And by the 1980 standard, we're looking at about 12 or 11% inflation. Those numbers feel more right to me. The way that they have effectively, when you're looking at these measures, these official government statistics, what you are looking at are numbers that are used to justify the thing that the government would already like to do. And so they basically work backwards to get from reality to non-reality that then reflects what they want. Now, this is significant on the 3% number specifically, because 3% is not the target for the Fed. The Fed's mandate, to the degree that it has a mandate, is for 2% inflation. And even 2% inflation has a bunch of problems associated with it, insofar as the value of your money degrading over time, which it very much has. So I think that this is an admission that things are running out of their control, and just trying to kind of get ahead of the game so they can act like, oh yeah, this was the plan all along, when really in the background what they're doing is they're saying to themselves, well, how can we change how we calculate inflation so that we can maintain this facade just a little bit longer? Naomi, I'm sure you've got great comments on this. Let's go to you.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with everything you're saying, Adam. And CPI has always been problematic. You've had economists dig into it and say, like, well, when you have technology improving in society, we should be seeing costs go down. And the fact that they're still going up, despite all the cost-saving measures that companies are employing, that there's something going on there. And I would agree that those higher inflation numbers seem more realistic. I also love the headline of that article. Yellen says inflation could reach 3% this year as recovery continues. I mean, if this is recovery, the complete debasement of the money supply, I would hate to see what getting worse looks like. I really can't blame El Salvador for saying, to hell with this. We're going to go with the thing that isn't being debased and isn't being inflated out of existence. Because, this is going to hurt so many people. And at Bitcoin Miami this weekend, everyone was so optimistic and excited and talking about Lambos and dreams and moonshots. I think that we should be talking about the people who don't understand their money is being debased and inflated away, and how much hurt they're going to be in the next decade, and finding ways to help these people and educate them, and not think about this as a get-rich-quick scheme. No, you're just getting poor less quickly, right? You're just finding ways to safeguard your wealth. And we should be having that conversation because I think it's an important one.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think that for the narrative, Adam, as you point out, that Yellen and others have going on here, they really emphasize the idea of like inflation being transitory. There's often, they throw it back to World War I or post World War II, post Vietnam, and where you saw a transitory inflation that later settled down. And they push back against this idea that we'll have high runaway inflation from the 1970s, which was also the creation of the Volcker rule and raising interest rates in response to inflation. Adam, do you have any thoughts on whether this is transitory versus runaway inflation, and what alternative measures of inflation might say about that?
So now it's before my time a little bit, but when you're talking about the inflation that started or that kind of ramped up in the 70s and then was there through kind of the early 80s until you got the Volcker rule, the Volcker rule was actually what wound up what wound up sort of fixing the inflation problem. And it fixed it by raising rates such that you couldn't have these kind of really low utility, low return use cases where new money could then be borrowed basically into existence in order to do that. So when you're thinking about it like this, I think this is very much more analogous to the 1970s. And the big problem is that there's so much federal government debt that they can't raise interest rates in order to offset it. So my expectation is that they will change the way that they measure it. They will change the way that they talk about it, and they will move the goalposts because they cannot fix the underlying problem. David?
So very
Let's
quickly,
quick comment from David, and then.
So as the nominal inflation dove at the table here, I do want to point to the specific reasons that they're talking about the transitory inflation, which is we do have all these supply chain bottlenecks that are a result of COVID. So things like cars, computer chips, which, by the way, Bitcoin is contributing to inflation in silicon. So there are some specific categories where production bottlenecks may be contributing to this. So just to put that in context.
For sure. Well, let's wrap it up there. That was a pretty meaty episode of The Hash. If you guys stick around, we are having All About Bitcoin with Christine Lee at 3 p.m. So make sure you stay at CoinDesk TV for that. Otherwise, go and have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll be back here tomorrow at 12 for another episode of The Hash. Thank you so much, everyone.
Peace, guys.